you are being watched to be the first lady of this church. You know, that's African American terminology for the pastor's wife. I was still hurt. I cried a lot in private because the women, the older women, the ones that were married, and the single women, they were the worst. Like I walked into a conversation about me. It was so heartbreaking. And I was mad with God, if I'm honest. Like, why are you letting them do this to me? They don't know me, but you do. Why are you letting them do this to me?
Today on the show, we have Mark and Brenda Croston. Brenda refers to herself in here in the show as Brenda or Michelle. So if you hear both, that's why she goes by Brenda Michelle Croston. And Mark works at Lifeway. That's how we got to know Mark.
Mark oversees Black Church leadership, and he is a dynamic, fun, huge Philadelphia Eagles fan guy. And their story of how they met and what God taught them through grief and forgiveness is incredible.
Mark was widowed. Brenda lost a child. Mark lost his dad at his early age. And so it's a story of grief and how to overcome that, and how Brenda was received and accepted into the church when she was a congregant, like she was part of the church. And then she and Mark ended up falling in love. And so how hard that was, how challenging it was.
You talk about a glass house episode. Here's a guy who lost his wife. He's living in this grief out in public view, trying not to let it taint every sermon he's preaching. And in the meantime, falling in love with a woman in the church. And they have this relationship that forms that's so special to both of them, but the church is not ready for it.
Right.
How they talk about the way they responded to criticism was really convicting and challenging and encouraging, but also just the honesty of how difficult it is sometimes to know that there are people in the church talking about you. Mm-hmm. You're going to hear a lot on the episode today, so tune in, and we'd love to know what you think about this. president@lifeway.com. Let us know your thoughts. So why don't we just get started right there? Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do and kind of where you are now?
Well, I currently serve at Lifeway as the director for Black Church Ministries. I would like to say my job is to come alongside pastors and help them to be successful, using Lifeway's research and resources and training to do that job.
Awesome. And Brenda, tell us a little bit about you.
I am by trade, a special education teacher, came out of the classroom in 2018, started Simple Truth Ministries. I can say now with confidence that I'm a publisher. My first author is about to go to print in the next couple months. And I'm a writer, a speaker, and I also train for Lifeway.
Awesome.
Oh, that's awesome.
We love it every time you're around, Brenda. You bring such a big smile every time, every room you walk into. So, Mark, we were together this last year, and you began to share some of the story of what happened with your first wife and how you and Brenda met. And I just thought, man, it is such a powerful story that I thought would be so cool to unpack here on the show. So why don't you guys talk about your journey as a couple?
All right. I guess I'll start, Brenda. I was pastoring in the church in Virginia. Brenda came and joined our church, I guess, right about 2 years before my first wife died. My first wife, I had breast cancer. She struggled with that for, 3 bouts. And in that last round, over a 15-year period, the Lord took her home. And sometime after that, Brenda and I started dating, and the rest is history.
That's a really big summary. Brenda, what would you add to that?
That's so funny. Yes, that is. I do think, thank you, Ben, for saying that we have a God story. We are opposites in so many ways. And so we're not in the same circles, although I was going to his church. I didn't like him. No, I liked him as a pastor. He was an amazing pastor. I had never been to a church where a pastor cared about A to Z in your life. With so many things we did, it was new to me. And he was, oh my gosh, he was such a great Bible teacher. And so as a pastor, I thought he was amazing. As a person, And like you said, I had come to this church. I was broken. My daughter had just died. well, I say just 2 years prior, my daughter had died. My marriage had broken up, and it was, let's say, a biblical breakup. Let's put it like that. So we can save the innocent and the guilty, right? So I thought in my mind, this is it. I had a young teenage son, and I thought it's just going to be him, God, and I. And one day, no joke, I had a dream about Mark. And I woke up from this dream like, oh my gosh, I have a demon inside of me. I'm dreaming about the pastor, And my friend, who's 9 years my junior, she calls me. Everybody calls me Michelle back home. And she says, Michelle, I don't know what this means, but you need to read the book of Ruth. And what she didn't know is that God had been taking my sleep for 2 weeks. 2 weeks I couldn't sleep. And during that time, he was calling me to read Ruth. And so when she said that, I started crying. And because I knew right then, like, God, you're telling me that this is my Boaz, but I don't even like him. And so I was supposed to help him with something for the ministry. And I just was all confused about my feelings. So I called him and was like, Dr. Croston, this is Michelle. I'm supposed to come over. I know that, but I can't. And so that sparked, like, it opened the door for him to text me, because apparently God wasn't just working on my heart. He was working on his too. Now, again, if he tells the story right, he would say that the first time he saw me, he thought I was Pentecostal is his word, because I had on a long skirt, everything was covered, no makeup, all the stuff. So he wasn't attracted to me either. So it's hilarious that God would start working on our hearts at the same time. And we talked on the phone for 120 hours. Now, ask me how I know, because my husband is thorough. He counted. And that's a miracle, because Mark is an introvert. Please don't be fooled by what you see in ministry when he's in the pulpit. He is an introvert. And so we talked on the phone for 120 hours before our first official date. But I was still like, this is the pastor. I can't date you. I remember him saying to me, he had called me and I was doing something. I said, hey, Dr. Croston, can I call you back? And he said, on one condition. Sure. He said, call me Mark. I went, I can't do that. You're the pastor. But that's how it began. And it was unbelievable. Like, I still feel the flutters in my stomach, in my heart, remembering how that time unfolded, and I could really see God's hand in it.
I think what's so interesting about that story is when you say 120 hours, so much of what happens behind the scenes people don't know and are not aware of. And so when you go out on your first date, some people may be like, well, this feels reactive, not knowing that there's 120 hours logged of conversation. And I think that probably happens so often that we just judge a situation not knowing how many hours have been logged on the phone beforehand.
Right.
Did you guys feel scrutinized? Did you try to have to keep your relationship under the radar? Like, how did that feel to be in the public eye in the glass house as a dating couple?
I kind of felt like, so we're transitioning. Don't forget that my first wife had passed, and I think there's a little bit of this that you kind of have to think about. So even though I knew that how sick she was, she never wanted anybody else to know. And she didn't want me to kind of share any of this with the congregation, or as little as possible, that kind of stuff. And so, I try to honor her request in this area. So in my own life, I'm grieving this loss over this long period of time. But I didn't really get to talk to the church in any real way about any of this until maybe 2 weeks before she passed. And so I and the church are really kind of in different spaces now. I've grieved most of my grief leading up to her death, and they're just hit with this cannonball and grieving after her death. And so I even said, let's see, she died a week before Thanksgiving that year. And so when the kids are home during Thanksgiving and Christmas, I'm sat them down at the table and I'm having a conversation with them and saying, I said, I just feel like the church is going to go a little crazy for a little while. And so I just want you guys to kind of be aware of that. Don't take anything personally. I just think that they're going to just kind of be a little off as they're going through this grief process. And sure enough, they did. They were, just a little bit extra in every kind of way.
Brenda is smiling as you're saying that, so I know there's a lot to this story.
Mark is very, what's the word? I don't know. He's so logical. He's really logical. And so he usually leads with logic and I lead with emotion.
Okay. And
so I didn't think about the fact that the church would hate the fact that he was dating me. I didn't, I thought that they were going to think, oh, here are these two broken hearts that God has put together. And I was thinking that they were going to think like I thought, this is amazing. Yeah. The two of them would never be together, or in any normal circumstance, right. But look at them falling in love. That didn't happen.
Oh, wow. See, I would have thought the same thing. I would have thought, what a sweet redemptive story for both of them. They both have been grieved by such loss, and now they find that in each other. But no, that was not the case.
You said hate. Yeah. I mean, so it went hard. It was hard.
It was hard. And so he was the pastor called to love these people. And so he didn't see them the same way I saw them. And so, there's a funny story where I come into Sunday school one day after I had been ridiculed. I read Paul's defense of his ministry the night before, and I'm just angry, right? And I'm like, they are not going to mess up my ministry. And the Lord put every obstacle in my way to make me late for Sunday school. I got there with 5 minutes to go, right? And I was sitting there, I was chewing some gum. And I was waiting for the question. Our teacher always said questions, comments, or concerns. I said, I have all three. And I just went off, right? My friend, the one who talked to me prior to, as Mark and I were starting to date afterwards, she's sitting across the room like, Michelle, no, that's what her face is saying. But it was too late. I was in it, and afterwards she said, you are being watched to be the first lady of this church. That's African-American terminology for the pastor's wife. And she said, I asked the Lord if the things that these people were saying about you were true. She said, and he told me to look at your fruit. She said, and so I looked at your son. And she said, I said to myself, there is no way that this fruit came from the tree that they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And that one thing made all the difference to me. I was still hurt. I cried a lot in private because the older women, the ones that were married and the single women, they were the worst. I walked into a conversation about me. It was so heartbreaking. And I was mad with God, if I'm honest. Why are you letting them do this to me? They don't know me, but you do. Why are you letting them do this to me? And so it was a very hard season for me. But Mark and his logic would always just, give me Bible verses. And, I'm thinking, no, I want you to get in the pulpit and rip them apart. I'm so glad that he did. I'm so glad that he did.
Yeah, my thought is that how do you deal with people's criticism or accusations when they're not true? And one, you really can't defend yourself. Right. You can't stand up and give your own version and all this because the people that don't believe you won't believe you anyway.
That's right.
So I always believe that one has to live such a life that even if an evil report is brought against you in some kind of way, that nobody who really knows you would believe it. And so and what she's talking about was not really most of the church. It was that vocal minority in the church among them. Yeah.
Ben, one of the reasons we had them on the show is because we had heard their story. We knew a little bit about the hurt and the hurt that Brenda had experienced, and just want to kind of to flesh it out for our audience of just what happens when the wife is not liked. Like the pastor's wife is not liked. That's
Absolutely.
hard.
It's hard enough to be a pastor's wife with all these expectations on you. But when there's a group in the church that just clearly doesn't like the pastor's wife, that causes problems on so many levels. Number one, the pastor begins to sense and feel that and becomes defensive or insecure. And then, of course, she comes into every room wondering if she's accepted.
Right.
So it can be a very difficult environment, the church, of knowing when you walk into a room, am I accepted here or am I rejected?
That's been a struggle for us, even our move to Lifeway. I mean, coming into some of the team huddles you do, just not knowing. It's just like uncertainty brings insecurity. And so you just feel like insecure walking into a room thinking, maybe they all love me, but that's not the chatter I'm hearing. And so which one of that person, for those people out there, doesn't like me?
I remember one particular meeting where I was speaking and the meeting was going great, but afterwards I could see like this look in your eyes of just concern. And I walked over to you and you said, I think I'm just going to go sit in the car for a while, because you just wanted to run out of the room because you felt like unprotected or unsafe or unwanted. And I feel like that's a feeling that a lot of pastors' wives probably experience, is like, I just would love to go get in my car for a while and not sit in this uncomfortable room where I wonder what people think of me.
And I mean, she gave a specific example. She didn't tell us what happened, but she said she walked up to a conversation where she was being talked about. And I think that happens pretty often and is really unfortunate, because it's just hard to know that you're being talked about.
Well, and here's the difficult thing about being a pastor's wife is, okay, let's say you're assertive and strong, a lion personality. There are going to be some that say, it's just too bad she's not gentle or kind or merciful. But if you're the other, there's going to be a group of people that say, she's just kind of stereotypical. She's a yes girl. She's going to do whatever he wants. In one sense, she's really strong. In another sense, she's more passive and just, goes with the flow personality. People might criticize her for either one, because if people are looking for something to pick on, they're going to find it.
Of course.
And I can only imagine what it was like for Brenda to step into those shoes after the grief that the church experienced, how difficult that must have been. You brought up the feeling of hurt, and I do think when you're in ministry and other people have an opinion about your life, it does hurt, and you start to think, I don't walk around giving you all of my opinions about your personal decisions, and so it can feel very unfair and the injustice of all. So how did you guys work through that? Did it take time? Did it take counseling? How did you unpack all that hurt?
Well, I was, again, Mark was very logical. And so he didn't take it personally. And it was really a whole lot of prayer, really talking to God, that honest kind of like, why is this happening? And he revealed a couple things to me. Number one, if you're going to be in ministry, you got to be able to take it. Yeah. Right. You have to be able to shoulder these kinds of things, because I'm called to show you God's grace. And if you are ridiculing me and you are shooting me with every arrow that you have and I don't retaliate, what better way to show God's love and grace? And he told me that he was excising some of the meanness out of me. Right. So we don't have time for my background story, but I had several traumatic incidents that caused me to be very, very mean, very, very, very quick tongued. Right. And so some of those things, the way that they made me feel, I vowed that I would never make anybody else feel that way. And if I did, I would make sure to come and apologize. I would never. And so I see the purpose now. And now that, I get to do what I do in ministry, you have to have a hard shell. You have to have a hard shell in the sense that I have on the armor of God. This is the armor of God. And when you're rejecting me, you're not necessarily rejecting me. And so I don't have to take it personally.
That sounded very mature and wise.
I'm still working on that process.
Yeah, I need to take some notes on that one. Mark, in this awkward period while you're dating Brenda and you're also filling the pulpit and people are talking, did you ever address it, or how did you talk about it from Scripture?
So each year at Valentine's Day, I would always do a message on love. And so that year, I pre-advertised my message. I was going to say a message on love from the pastor's love life. That was the title of the message.
Oh my!
So as I'm talking about this, my mom who had now retired, and she had moved down from Philadelphia. She was now a member of my church at this point, right? And so how do I kind of talk to the congregation? This is what I want to do about relationships and about grieving and about moving on to new areas and that kind of stuff. And so I'm talking about this, and I reminded them, I said, my dad died when I was in my first month of first grade. So my mom was sitting out there in the congregation. I said, my dad died when I was in my first month of first grade. So that was 50 years ago. And so I said that, to my knowledge, I said, my mother never even went on another date. So my dad was a pastor at the time. So I'm getting this pastor's wife scenario from my mom and dad, and then I'm going to apply mine. I said, so to my knowledge, my mom never went on another single date after my dad died. And I added in, not that it was any of my business, but to my knowledge, she did.
That was a subtle way of addressing that.
Yes. And so I said, I don't have my mother's gifts. And so I said, so there will be, so I made this announcement then. I said, there will be another Sister Croston someday. So, you all just need to get ready for this, because you want me to live a holy and righteous life. And so there will be another Sister Croston coming sometime.
That is.
And
so
how
good.
did they respond?
They kind of took it in on their own. The interesting thing was I had to be in our state office for the Baptist General Association on that Monday. So I preached this on Sunday. We're not even streaming, right? We've got a little local cable station, but that's only right there in our city. So we're not streaming this on Facebook or anything. By the time I get to the Virginia office in Richmond on Monday morning, the staff at the state office is telling me the details of my message on Sunday. And I'm saying, how in the world could you all have even heard of this? So there's apparently a lot of interest in this. That's all I'm saying.
News travels fast, clearly.
One of the things I'm interested in, I'm thinking of a pastor right now, a well-known pastor in Nashville, whose wife suddenly died a couple of months ago. And he texted me recently. He just feels so lost, uncertain of how he's going to move forward. We don't think about this in ministry when we sign up to lead a church, that we might be the recipients of enormous grief. I wonder what you all have learned about grief. Mm-hmm. And for someone out there who finds themselves leading in a local church, but their heart is broken, what did you learn about yourselves, and what advice do you give to others in that?
Grief is the grace of God. We have always, so I walk a lot in our neighborhood, and oftentimes there are dead animals, and I see what I call buzzards, but they're really vultures. The vultures are coming to clean up or to eat the dead animals. And one day I was running and I came back, and every piece of that animal was gone that I had seen on my way out. And God said, grief is like the vulture. It's ugly. It looks scary. It's dark, but it is my cleanup system. So grief has a perfect work. We should not, we always tell people, be strong, don't cry, don't do this, don't do that. but grief has a purpose. God gave us grief as a grace because there has to be some kind of process that we go through in order to let go of the things that once was. And so I've learned that grief is a grace, and I want to go through the process. I need to go through the process. And unless, if I don't, I'll be stuck. I'll be stuck. And so I'm appreciative of grief. It's not easy, but it's necessary.
So as a pastor, I preached, I don't even know how many funerals I've preached and how many bedsides I've sat next to. But the one thing I've always told people, and I embrace it for myself, is that your tears are an expression of your love. Yeah. Right? I know a lot of people who died or had tragedy, and I never shed a single tear over many of them because I didn't have a relationship with them. And I didn't necessarily, in that sense, love them. So the only time when tears really come well up in my eyes is because I've lost somebody or something that I loved. And so that means that now I can appreciate the fact that I cry. I appreciate it because it is each tear is a reminder to me that I've lost something that I really had a great love for. And so I can now move my thoughts about what it was I loved about that experience, that relationship, or whatever it was, rather than just the fact that I lost it. And so my dad has now been deceased over 50 years. And every now and then there's still something that somebody will say or do that will remind me of him. And that feeling will come back as fresh as it was the day he died. But I embrace that because that meant that the love is still there.
Yeah.
Tears are an expression of your love. I loved the way that Mark said that. I thought it was so sweet. I mean, coming from someone who has grieved like he has, I mean, he's really essentially saying, be joyful for these tears because it means that you have loved well.
And it's interesting how different people think about grief. I mean, one of the most famous C.S. Lewis quotes is, "Who knew that grief felt so much like fear?" And for Lewis, grief caused him to be scared that he would never have that feeling again, that he would never be joyful again. But Mark was able to look at grief from the sense of, like, this is a good thing. God's reminding me that I've lost something that's special and I need to grieve it. And one of the things I appreciate about them as a couple is that they recognize that it's important to model to the congregation that they're human beings who have emotions and they have to work through them just like everybody else. You know, grief comes in many forms. It's not just the loss of a person. It could be the loss of a dream or, you know, I know when we came to Lifeway, we were not prepared for the grief process of saying goodbye to the church that we started in those relationships. Like there was a whole couple of years we didn't realize of just grieving the loss of that. That is just part of the human experience, but it's hard to lead when you feel that heaviness in your heart. I can't imagine what that would have been like for the two of you.
Well, I think that the pastor knows, you know, Super Bowl is coming up on soon, by the way. I just want to mention that. And
by the time this airs, it'll already be over, Mark.
But you're wearing your shirt.
So good. We'll already know that the Eagles have won.
Oh, right.
So, but this is what I know, that the pastor, you know, has to put on that game face every Sunday sometimes.
Yep.
Right? There are certainly times when I was going through very troubled personal circumstances. But when I come to the pulpit, it's not, the church doesn't want to hear that. They didn't come there to hear the pastor gripe or complain or, lament. They came to get a message of hope and reconciliation and forgiveness. And so there were so often this is what I would do, because I can think, in that year following my wife's death, I don't think I preached just between you and me. So I don't think I ever preached a new sermon that year. So don't tell anybody.
Okay, well,
but I don't think I preached a new sermon because I couldn't write one. So the great thing was I had 20 years of messages all stored up. And so I really literally just preached the highlights of those 20 years and with some fresh illustrations. And I preached to me more than I preached to anybody else. I preached to me. And so in my mind, I'm preaching to myself, trying to help me. And I'm letting you guys just listen in to my conversation with God about the stuff I'm going through. Because the one thing I know is that everybody has the same issues, right?
That's right.
We're all human creatures. It doesn't matter race, economic standing, nationality. We all have the same human issues. And so I figure if I'm preaching to me, I'm preaching to somebody else out there too.
That's really good.
I think it's important to say, though, Mark, that you were preaching to yourself, right? And so even though you believe that you didn't lament or complain, it was there. It was just wrapped in that sermon. And so I want to say, to every pastor that heard that, it's like, I got to put on my game face. Well,
it's going to come out.
Yes, it's going to come out. And so something we don't do in the church is sit down in our grief. And it's okay if somebody else sees it. As a matter of fact, it's necessary because you need to know, like as Christians, we think that, I'm going to put Jesus on it. Jesus, when Jesus wants to get in our stuff with us.
Yeah.
He wants to walk through it with us. And so it's okay that as Mark was preaching to himself, all of his issues were coming out in those sermons. It's okay. Of course, we don't want the pastor to not be able to sustain himself through a message. We don't want that. But we do want to know that you're human, and we want the opportunity to walk alongside you if you'll let us,
I want to hear the two of you ladies talk about the imposter syndrome of being a pastor's wife, and you never signed up for that. We hear that a lot from pastors' wives. They think, I don't know why God chose me for this role, never saw this coming. Brenda, there had to be some of that with you in terms of how could God thrust this on me? How did you work through that, those feelings of just being inferior? Well,
I'm assuming, was your first husband in ministry?
My first husband was a youth pastor.
Oh, he was in ministry.
Yes. But, I feel like that was different because at the time, my daughter was sick. She was born brain damaged. And so it required 24 hours, 7 days a week of my time. So no one hardly ever saw me. I was at home taking care of my children. And so I was shielded in a way by the sickness. So this was the first time that I was on the front line.
And what was that like?
So I think I have a different experience, right? So since I'm a decade or so younger than Mark, they treated me like a kid. And Lindley, that reminds me, I owe you an apology. You don't remember me probably because I might have offended you the first time I saw you. You guys walked up and I went, you guys look like babies. And, I'm reminded now of how much I hated that.
Yeah.
And so they treated me like I was a kid, like I wasn't going to be able to minister to Mark, in the wife role. And because I had been in the congregation, I had only really been coming for a year because, like I said, my daughter had died and I mostly was home with her. And so I had been coming a year and a half by the time Mark and I dated on a regular basis. And so I was one of them. And so they were offended that the pastor didn't go outside of the church and get a wife. And so not only did they treat me like I was too young to step into the pastor's role, they treated me like I wasn't worthy to step into that role. And so I have to tell you this story. Our nephew is a pastor in Philadelphia. Mark had invited him to do our summer revival. It was 5 days back then. On that 5th day, by this time we were married. And I'm not kidding. Mark would say that I over exaggerate this, but I literally, you know how women are. They hated me. The ones who hated me hated me. And the ones who loved me loved me. Yeah. Right. So I was rocking someone's baby, you know, and the baby wouldn't quiet down. So I went out in the vestibule, rocked the baby to sleep. By this time, the message is over. I come back in, hand the baby off to the mom. I turn around to pick my things up. And when I turn around, there's a line of women waiting for me. A line of women. The first one is a woman in her 70s who a year prior to stood on my foot. She didn't know she was standing on my shoe, and I'm silly. So I was giggling on the inside, like, aren't you like 100 with one foot in the grave? You should be praying instead of trying to hurt me. This woman was the first one. And she threw her arms around me and said, Michelle, I'm so sorry. I don't know why. And woman after woman, young, old, was in that line hugging me and apologizing. So much so that I fell back on the pew and I was just a mess. Mark walks past and like, what's wrong with her? It's because I have to say what our nephew preached. He preached about the woman who was bent over and healed. I don't know what he said because I didn't hear all of it. I don't know what he said, but there was a line of women. Wow. And let me tell you that every woman that wronged me, except for one, came back and apologized. Not that day. So there was a line that day, but during that week, I went out to lunch, including our daughter. So our daughter was, you know, hurt that we were getting married, you know, and she even took me out to lunch that week and said, Miss Michelle, I'm sorry. It was crazy. It was the hand of God. And so what it taught me, if you wait on the Lord, he will renew your strength. And not only that, he will make your enemy your footstool in this sense that they will bring you comfort. Not that I get to step on them because my footstool, I have one right in front of me. I put my feet on it for comfort. They came alongside me and comforted me. It was amazing.
That's an incredible story. Very few people get that moment when so many people say they're sorry like that. Mark, that had to be deeply encouraging to you.
Yeah. So I think that there were two transitions in all of these relationships. One, when I first announced that Brenda and I were going to get married, a little bit of the craziness subsided. And then at this moment, it was like the rest of it just kind of dissipated and went away. So, you know, God moves in those great ways.
So, I mean, the end of the story for the listener, were you able to stay at that church and redeem those relationships and kind of happily ever after or no?
Well, here's the funny part. So as soon as all of this happens, God whisks us away to Nashville. It's God, you know, opens the door for us to come to Nashville. And we didn't get to stay. But I will say that I have a small group Bible study that I do on Tuesday nights. And over the year or two that I've been doing it, I've had, 10 members from that church to come alongside and be a part of. I've done women's retreats and they come and support. And so those relationships are definitely redeemed.
Right. But I wouldn't say the Lord whisked us away to Nashville. Okay. The Lord tore us away from the church we love. Right. So we did not want to come, and there was nothing that said we needed to leave the church or anything. Everything was great by this time. So but God twisted our arms to come and do this, though we love doing that.
Well, what a blessing that he did allow some healing to happen before he called you away so that you could leave on a positive note. That's great. One last question I want to ask is, I know Lindley and I have two very different personalities, and sometimes when there's a conflict in the church, we both have very different views on how we should handle it. And sometimes we're opposite. Sometimes I'll be the one that wants to confront it head on, and she says, no, just calm down. And then other times she wants me to say something, and I think, no, now's the time to be silent. Did you guys have quite a bit of interpersonal conflict about how to handle difficult people in the church early on, or were you guys united? How did that go?
Mark would say, I was like all the time, confront. And I did recognize, though, that he had so much more experience than me. So I did yield to his leadership. What would you say, babe?
That's right. That's right. A soft answer turns away wrath. So, you just have to be patient, right? Nobody in the church is perfect.
Yeah.
And so we know we're working in an imperfect union of people. And so you got to, if you want grace, this is what I've always believed, you got to give a lot of grace and allow people to work through this stuff.
That's really good. And I struggle with patience, and I've noticed this with the Lord sometimes, like things I want to confront, if I'll just calm down and give it time, like a lot of these things tend to resolve themselves, and I can save myself a lot of hurt and energy. So Mark, that sounds like a lot of wisdom there, probably from the school of hard knocks. Years ago, I heard a quote from Chuck Swindoll that life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond. In ministry, often you and I have not agreed on how to respond. So there's a difficult situation in the church, and it might be that I'm just feeling really bold that week, and I'm ready to address this. I'm ready to call a meeting, and you're like, Ben, you're going to make a mountain out of a molehill. And then sometimes it's the opposite, where you feel so hurt that I'm not willing to say something. And yet I feel like it's not the right moment to directly confront this issue. It causes conflict in marriage, particularly in Christian leadership.
I think the hardest part about that is the relationship then when you go back home, because most pastors and pastors' wives are going to put on a united front in front of the church, in front of their friends. But then when you go home and you just begin to question, is he being wise? Is he being loyal? Am I being wise? Or am I enabling? There's all these emotions that process through that you're trying to figure out what is the right thing to do. What's the right response? And there's really no guidelines for it. And so that's what breeds, I think, a lot of the insecurity, a lot of the frustrations between pastor and pastor's wife is just the unknown. Like, it's all unknown, really. I mean, I think the one thing you and I have had to learn is just to step back from it and take some time. I mean, it's always wrong to respond immediately. And I mean, there have been times where I've sent you things and said, can I say this? I'll just write out a text, and you'll say, you can after you sit on it for 24 hours, because you know that after 24 hours, I'm going to have cooled off and thought that would be unwise to send.
Well, that goes both ways. I've typed up emails before that I've let you read, and you've said, that's just mean. Don't send that. Or I've already sent it, and you'd be like, yeah, that was mean. And so I do think all of us see this from a different lens. And what's so hard in marriage is you don't ever want your wife to feel like you left her high and dry. But at the same time, you don't want to overreact to a situation and blow up something in the church. It's very tenuous.
I think this goes back to that women conversation of like, if men and the church are supposed to be the leaders and the spiritual leaders, then, you should protect me. You need to lead me and you need to protect me. And I feel unprotected here. So I need you to take care of the situation. But that's not necessarily always protection. Like, taking care of a situation vocally is not always the best thing. It could be that you just need to sit down and pray over something for a while.
Or just let it hurt and deal with the hurt rather than deal with the person.
Well, I mean, that goes back to when Brenda was talking about how grief is like a vulture, and it can just be so ugly, but then it turns clean. You know, it's really a cleansing process. And so, sometimes, yeah, you're right. Just hurting is the right thing. The Glass House is a production of Lifeway. It's produced and edited by Angie Elkins, sound engineering by Dale Sandberg, original music by Robert Elkins, photography by Rebecca McVeigh, and artwork by Heather Berzensky. We are your hosts, Ben and Lindley Mandrell. Thanks for listening.